What if a simple act of kindness on a snowy mountain road could change your entire life? In a quiet town tucked beneath the shadow of the mountains, a struggling single father crosses paths with a mysterious woman stranded in a storm. He doesn't know she's a billionaire, fleeing her own kind of loneliness, and neither of them could imagine how one night would set off a chain of events that would transform not just their lives, but an entire community. This is a story about second chances, about how goodness has a way of coming back to you, and how love sometimes arrives when and where you least expect it. Before we dive into this heartfelt journey, if you enjoy stories about hope, love, and the quiet power of kindness, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss any of the inspiring tales we share here, each one crafted to leave you with something warm and lasting. Now, let's begin. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Havenridge, sweeping flecks of snow across the cracked pavement like tiny shards of glass. Calder Hayes pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders as he locked the worn wooden door of his modest cabin. The crunch of his boots echoed faintly in the stillness, the only sound aside from the distant whistle of the mountain wind. He paused at the edge of his porch, glancing toward the endless stretch of pine trees lining the base of the mountains. The peaks loomed silent and white, their sharp ridges catching the faintest glimmer of the sinking sun. Winter here was a thing that seeped into your bones, not just through the cold, but in the silence, the isolation. Behind him, the faint sound of humming drifted from inside. Maisie, his daughter's small voice, carried lightly, off-key and innocent as she colored by the fireplace. Calder smiled faintly, though there was a tiredness to the curve of his lips. She was 8 now, the bright spot in an otherwise muted existence. Since her mother passed 3 years ago, Maisie had become his world, a fragile, beautiful thing he was desperate to protect, even as the weight of life pressed heavier with each passing winter. Calder stepped off the porch, his breath clouding. In the frigid air, he crossed the yard toward the small tool shed, the structure sagging under years of neglect. Another repair job had fallen through that morning. The Johnsons decided they'd fix their roof themselves, money being tight this year. He didn't blame them. It was the same story all over Havenridge. Times were hard. They'd always been hard, but Calder wasn't one to complain. He simply rolled up his sleeves, fixed what he could, and moved forward, one step at a time. Inside the shed, he retrieved his toolbox, pausing to glance at the photo taped to the inside wall. A young woman with laughing eyes, holding a toddler. His late wife, Laurel. He pressed his fingertips briefly against the image, a small ritual, before heading back toward the house. Maisie met him at the door, her brown curls poking out from beneath a knitted hat that hung too low on her forehead. "Daddy, is Mr. Ira coming over tonight?" she asked, hopeful. Calder shook his head. "Not tonight, Bug. Too cold for him to be out." Maisie's face fell, but she nodded. "I was going to show him my drawing." "You can show me instead," Calder offered gently, wiping his boots before stepping inside. She beamed, already racing to grab her latest masterpiece from the hearth. Calder crouched down beside her as she held it up proudly. A crooked house under a mountain, with stick figures standing by a tree. In the corner, a blazing yellow sun, incongruously bright for the grey world outside. "That's us," she explained, pointing to the stick figures. "You, me, and Mr. Ira, and that's Mommy, up in the sun." Calder felt something catch in his chest. He smoothed a hand over her hair, the ache of love and longing mixing in his throat. "It's perfect, Maisie." They spent the evening as they often did, quietly, simply. Calder fixed a leaky faucet while Maisie read aloud from her storybook. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper. Outside, the wind howled stronger. By the time he tucked Maisie into bed, the temperature had dropped sharply. Calder stood for a moment at her doorway, watching her chest rise and fall in sleep, her fingers curled loosely around the worn, stuffed rabbit she wouldn't part with. When he returned to the small kitchen, he poured himself a mug of weak coffee, staring out the window at the dark stretch of road leading into the mountains. Snowflakes swirled chaotically under the porch light. It was then he saw them, headlights, dim and flickering, cutting uncertainly through the curtain of snow. A vehicle, inching its way down the winding road, dangerously close to the ditch that lined the edge. Calder set down his mug. Something about the way the car crawled forward sent a prickle down his spine. He grabbed his coat, pulling it over his shoulders as he stepped back out into the cold. The wind bit at his face as he jogged to the edge of the road. The car, a dark SUV, lurched slightly, its tires spinning uselessly in the snow. Calder waved his arms, motioning the driver to stop. The window rolled down, revealing a woman inside, her face pale, eyes wide with unease. She looked out of place amidst the storm, her hair perfectly styled, her coat far too thin for the weather. "Are you all right?" Calder called over the wind. She leaned toward the window. I think I took a wrong turn. I'm trying to get down the mountain, but I can't see a thing." Calder nodded, assessing the way her tires were partially sunk in the snow. "You're not going to make it down in this. Best you come inside, wait it out." She hesitated, glancing back toward the winding, treacherous road, clearly debating whether to trust a stranger in the middle of nowhere. Calder lifted his hands, palms up. "Got a little one in the house, safe as can be." That seemed to sway her. She gave a small, almost reluctant nod. Calder guided her carefully out of the SUV, grabbing a flashlight as he led her toward the cabin. Inside, the warmth from the fire met them like a soft embrace. Maisie stirred slightly from her room, but didn't wake. The woman stood awkwardly near the door, brushing snowflakes from her coat. Calder offered his hand. "Name's Calder Hayes." There was a pause before she took it, her grip delicate. "Juniper," she said simply. "Juniper Vaughn." The name didn't mean anything to him. Just another traveler caught in the storm. But outside, the wind howled louder, as if signaling that both their lives were about to change in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The cabin felt smaller now, with a stranger standing inside, her polished presence somehow at odds with the worn furniture and creaking floorboards. Calder hung his coat by the door, brushing snow from his sleeves as he glanced over at Juniper. Vaughn. She stood near the hearth, shifting awkwardly, her hands still gloved, eyes darting about the room like she wasn't sure where to land. "Make yourself comfortable," Calder offered, his voice even but not overly warm. He was a man who measured his words carefully, much like how he measured the wood he worked with, precise, functional, no excess. Juniper peeled off her gloves, then hesitated before finally unbuttoning her coat. Underneath, she wore a fitted sweater that seemed more suited for a city coffee shop than a snowstorm. She rubbed her arms, her posture tense, shoulders drawn tight. "You can sit." Calder nodded toward the old armchair near the fire. "I'll put on some coffee," she offered. A small, polite smile, but didn't speak, lowering herself gingerly onto the chair as though it might collapse beneath her. Calder moved to the stove, filling the kettle with practiced motions, all the while studying her from the corner of his eye. Something about her unsettled him, not in a threatening way, but like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit in the picture. Her clothes, her mannerisms, the way her gaze lingered on the chipped countertops and faded curtains. She was clearly not from around here. Maisie's soft footsteps padded into the room, rubbing her eyes. Calder turned quickly. "Bug, everything all right?" She stopped when she noticed Juniper blinking sleepily. "Who's that?" Calder crouched down beside his daughter. "This is Miss Juniper. She got caught in the storm. She'll stay here tonight." Maisie's shyness flickered only briefly before curiosity took over. She stepped forward, her head tilted. "Do you like drawing?" she asked without preamble. Juniper blinked, then offered the faintest smile. "I suppose I do." Maisie nodded, approvingly, as though that answered all questions. "You can sit by the fire, it's warmer there." Calder hid a smile as he poured water into 2 chipped mugs, sliding one toward Juniper. She accepted it with a murmured thank you, her fingers curling around the mug like she needed something solid to hold on to. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackling of the logs and the whistle of wind against the window panes. Calder didn't rush to fill it. Years of solitary nights had taught him that sometimes quiet spoke louder than words. Finally, Juniper broke it. "You live here long?" she asked, her voice softer now, testing the waters. "All my life," Calder answered simply. "This cabin's been in my family 3 generations." She nodded, staring into the fire. "It's peaceful." He studied her face in the flickering light, sharp cheekbones, faint traces of fatigue under her eyes. Not the kind of tired that came from physical labor, but something deeper. Emotional exhaustion, maybe. He'd seen enough of that in himself to recognize it. "You're not from around here," Calder said, not as a question but a fact. Juniper let out a soft breath, the corner of her mouth twitching. "No, passing through, I guess." Maisie yawned and leaned against her father's side, her thumb slipping toward her mouth before she caught herself and stood up straighter. Calder smoothed her curls. "Why were you driving up here this late?" he asked, voice level. For a moment Juniper seemed to hesitate, her gaze flickering toward the window, like she might bolt back out into the storm. "I needed to get away," she admitted finally. "Too many things." Pressing in, Calder didn't pry further. Everyone had reasons for running, some louder than others. He nodded toward the small bedroom. "You can take Maisie's room tonight. She'll bunk with me." Juniper opened her mouth, perhaps to protest, but something in Calder's steady gaze told her arguing would be wasted breath. She simply nodded, murmuring another quiet, "Thank you." As he stood to guide Maisie to bed, she tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, can we keep her?" she whispered, too soft for Juniper to hear. Calder chuckled under his breath, ruffling her hair. "She's not a stray pup, Bug." Still, the thought lingered longer than it should as he tucked Maisie in. The weight of loneliness sitting a little heavier on his chest tonight. Later, after the house had settled into stillness, Calder stood by the kitchen window, looking out over the snow-blanketed yard. The moon peeked through ragged clouds, casting pale light over the empty road. Somewhere far off, a coyote's call echoed against the mountains. Behind him, he could hear the faint rustle of Juniper shifting in the spare room, her steps careful, unfamiliar with the creaks and groans of an old house. He wondered briefly what kind of life she came from, what world she'd left behind, to find herself stranded in the middle of nowhere. There was something about her presence he couldn't quite shake, like a storm gathering just out of sight. But storms, Calder knew, had a way of revealing more than they destroyed. He took one last look at the moonlit peaks, then turned off the lamp. Tomorrow, when the storm cleared, perhaps she'd be on her way, or perhaps not. Morning came slow and grey, the sky still heavy with remnants of last night's storm. The snow had settled thick across Havenridge, muffling sound and softening every edge. Calder stood at the sink, watching as a few brave birds fluttered near, the bare branches outside, pecking for whatever they could find. Behind him, the faint shuffle of footsteps echoed, cautious and unfamiliar. Juniper appeared in the kitchen doorway, her dark hair pulled hastily back, a borrowed sweater from Maisie, draped loosely over her frame. It hung slightly oversized, but she wore it with quiet grace. "Morning," Calder greeted without turning. "Good morning." Her voice was lighter, but still carried that hint of hesitation, as though she was unsure how much space she was allowed to occupy. Calder set down the mug he'd been nursing. "Coffee's fresh. Help yourself." She nodded, stepping carefully toward the counter, as if afraid to disturb the rhythm of the house. Calder noticed how her eyes drifted to the small details. The chipped tile near the stove, the stack of schoolbooks on the table, the worn coat draped over a chair. It struck him again how she seemed out of place, like a piece from another puzzle entirely. Maisie came bounding in a moment later, all sleepy energy and crooked smiles. "Morning, Miss Juniper," she chirped, tugging at her father's sleeve. "Can I show her the barn?" Calder raised an eyebrow. "Snow's still deep out there, Bug." Maisie pouted but turned to Juniper expectantly. Juniper glanced toward the window, where the sunlight struggled to break through the thick clouds. "I don't mind," she said softly. "If it's all right with you." Calder hesitated, then gave a short nod. "Stay close." Maisie whooped, already pulling on her boots. Calder grabbed his own coat, offering Juniper an extra scarf without comment as they stepped out into the cold. The world outside was whitewashed, pristine, almost too quiet. Snow crunched underfoot as they trudged toward the old barn, the structure sagging slightly under years of weather and wear. Maisie bounded ahead, chattering about the chickens they used to keep and how Daddy promised to fix up the place once spring comes. Calder watched Juniper as she moved carefully through the drifts, one hand brushing against the weathered wood of the barn door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of hay and old timber. Light streamed through cracks in the roof, illuminating dust, motes swirling lazily. Maisie darted to the far corner, pointing out a nest tucked beneath a rafter. "See, sometimes birds still come in here." Juniper smiled, crouching beside her. "It's like a little hiding place." Maisie nodded solemnly. "Daddy says even broken things can still be useful." Calder, standing nearby, felt Juniper, glanced toward him at that. There was a pause, quiet but full. Juniper traced a finger along one of the support beams, her expression thoughtful. "This place has a character," she murmured. Calder gave a short laugh, rough around the edges. "That's one word for it." Maisie tugged at Juniper's hand, leading her to the ladder that once led to the loft. "Daddy says when Mommy was here they used to sit up there and watch stars." Juniper's gaze softened. "That sounds nice." Maisie nodded, her voice quieter now. "Sometimes I think Mommy still watches us." Calder swallowed thickly, clearing his throat. "All right, Bug. Let's not stay out too long." They trudged back toward the cabin, snowflakes beginning to fall again in soft spirals. Inside, Juniper helped Maisie peel off her layers, brushing snow from her hair with surprising tenderness. It was a simple moment, but it caught Calder off guard, the way Juniper knelt beside his daughter like she'd done it 1,000 times before, as if she fit naturally into the space she'd only just entered. Later, while Maisie busied herself at the table drawing, Calder stood by the fire, glancing at Juniper as she stared out the window. "You're good with her," he remarked. Casually, she looked over, surprised. "She's easy to be around," he nodded, folding his arms across his chest. "Not everyone knows what to do with kids." Juniper hesitated, then turned back to the window. "I didn't have much of a family growing up, just expectations." Her voice trailed off, the weight of unsaid things filling the space between them. Calder didn't press, but something inside him shifted slightly, a realization, maybe, that beneath her polished exterior she carried cracks of her own. By late afternoon, the snow had eased, and Calder went about stacking wood near the shed. He noticed Juniper lingering nearby, her hands tucked deep in her borrowed coat. "You always fix everything yourself?" she asked, watching as he hammered a loose plank back into place. He shrugged. "Somebody has to." She chewed her lip thoughtfully, then blurted, "Where I come from, people pay others to do everything." Calder didn't answer immediately. He could feel the tension rolling off her, the conflict she tried to keep hidden beneath polite smiles. Finally, he met her gaze. "Sometimes doing things yourself is the only way to know they're done right." Her eyes flickered, something unreadable flashing across them. As the sun dipped low, casting a soft orange glow over the snow, Calder motioned toward the house. "Supper's simple," he said, "but you're welcome." She gave him a small, genuine smile. Simple sounds good, and for the first time since she'd arrived, it felt like something fragile but real had settled between them. Not questions, not pretenses, just two people who knew what it was to patch things together, even when life left cracks. The next day broke clearer, though the heavy snow still blanketed the town in thick silence, the kind of quiet that almost felt too still, like the world was holding its breath. Calder stood by the window, sipping his coffee, eyes scanning the mountain ridge where yesterday's storm had swept through. The roads were still slick, the sky pale and empty. Juniper sat quietly at the kitchen table, Maisie beside her, both hunched over a sheet of paper. Calder watched as Maisie explained her drawing, stick figures standing by a crooked house, a yellow sun smiling in the corner. Juniper listened attentively, nodding and asking questions, as though she'd known Maisie for much longer than 2 days. There was something effortless about the way Juniper blended into the morning routine. No pretense, no polite distance like the night before. Calder wasn't sure if it unsettled him or made the house feel less hollow. After breakfast, he shrugged on his coat and gestured toward the door. "Heading over to Della's cafe. She needs the porch steps fixed before the next freeze." Juniper looked up, something flickering behind her eyes. "Do you need a hand?" Calder raised an eyebrow. "You ever handled a hammer?" She smiled faintly. "I can learn." Maisie clapped her hands. "Can I come too?" He glanced at his daughter's hopeful face, then back to Juniper. Against his better judgment, or maybe because of something else entirely, he nodded. "All right, let's go." The town of Havenridge was the kind where everyone knew everyone, and strangers didn't go unnoticed. As they walked toward the main street, the snow crunching beneath their boots, Calder caught the curious glances tossed their way. Della's cafe sat at the corner, a modest building with faded red shutters, a hand-painted sign swaying in the wind. Della Monroe herself stood on the porch, bundled in a thick scarf, her eyes sharp and knowing. She gave Calder a nod, then her gaze slid over to Juniper, lingering. "Well now," Della said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Didn't expect you'd be bringing help." Calder grunted. Seemed she needed something to do. Juniper extended a polite smile. "I'm Juniper, just passing through." Della's eyes narrowed thoughtfully, but she didn't pry. Instead, she motioned toward the steps. "Those boards have been loose since last winter. Took me near breaking my neck yesterday." Calder set to work pulling out his tools. Maisie plopped herself down on the steps, content to watch. Juniper stood beside him, attentive, silent at first as she observed his movements. "You do this for a living?" she asked after a while, voice soft. "Fix things," Calder replied without looking up. "Yeah, houses, barns, whatever needs mending." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Why not leave? Move somewhere with more opportunity." Calder paused, hammer poised mid-air. He glanced at her, something guarded behind his eyes. "This is home." Juniper opened her mouth, but whatever she intended to say, she swallowed it back. Instead, she knelt beside him, fingers brushing against the edge of a splintered board. "Tell me what to do," she said simply. For the next hour, they worked in companionable silence. Calder showed her how to steady the nails, how to measure before cutting. She listened carefully, hands awkward at first, but gaining confidence. Maisie cheered each time a new plank was secured, her laughter bouncing off the frosted windows. Inside the cafe, Della watched through the glass, her expression unreadable. When the last board was in place, Calder stood back, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. Juniper straightened, breathing hard, strands of hair sticking to her cheek. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked almost content, grounded. Della stepped outside, handing Calder 2 mugs of coffee, then offering one to Juniper. "You've got steady hands," she remarked casually. "Most folks who pass through here aren't looking to get their hands dirty." Juniper accepted the mug, giving a non-committal smile. "Guess there's a first time for everything." Della's gaze lingered sharp beneath the kind exterior, but she didn't press further. Calder noticed it, though. The quiet appraisal. In Havenridge, people didn't ask outright, but they always noticed when someone didn't quite fit. Walking back toward the cabin, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the snowdrifts. Maisie skipped ahead, kicking at clumps of ice. Juniper walked beside Calder, her steps slower now. "You don't ask many questions," she remarked suddenly. Calder glanced at her, puzzled. "Not much need." She looked down at her gloves, fiddling with the edge. "Most people, they want to know more. Why I'm here, where I came from." He shrugged. "Figure you'll say if you want to." Juniper's smile was small, almost sad. "It's strange." "What is?" "How quiet it is here. People don't want something from you." Calder's jaw tightened. He understood far more than he let on, the weight of expectations, of always being seen for what you can give, rather than who you are. They reached the porch, Maisie already inside. Calder paused before opening the door. "Everyone's got cracks," he said quietly. "Some folks just hide them better." Their eyes met, something unspoken stretching between them, not prying, not demanding, just seeing. Juniper nodded once, as if she understood. That night, after Maisie had gone to bed, Calder stood outside, leaning against the railing, staring at the distant mountains. Behind him, he heard the door creak, soft footsteps approaching. Juniper stood beside him, her breath clouding in the cold air. "I'll be leaving soon," she said after a moment, "when the road's clear." Calder didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the moon hung low over the peaks. "Storm's still passing," he said finally. "No sense rushing out before it's done." She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her shoulders eased, just slightly. Maybe, for now, that was enough. The weather turned sharper overnight. Calder could feel it long before the first flurry of snow touched the window panes, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, coiling tight. Havenridge winters had a way of sneaking up like that, quiet and sudden. He stood on the front porch at dawn, watching heavy clouds roll down from the peaks. The sky was a pale steel, wind tugging at the bare branches. Behind him, Juniper appeared, pulling her borrowed sweater tighter. "Another storm?" she asked, voice low. Calder nodded. "Looks that way." Maisie shuffled sleepily in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. Calder crouched, brushing her curls from her face. "Best we stay put today," he told them both. Juniper glanced at the sky again, a crease forming between her brows. "I thought about leaving this morning, but maybe I'll wait." Calder gave her a look, half amused, half resigned. Smart. By mid-morning, the snow fell harder, thick and fast, blanketing everything in sight. Calder moved through the cabin with steady purpose, stocking firewood, checking the generator, laying extra blankets by the hearth. Years of living here had taught him preparation wasn't just a habit, it was survival. Juniper hovered nearby, following his motions quietly, offering help without being asked. She carried wood in from the shed, her steps careful on the slick porch, cheeks pink from the cold. Maisie worked on another drawing at the table, humming softly, oblivious to the mounting tension outside. The power flickered once around noon, then steadied again. Calder's jaw tightened. He knew better than to trust the lines wouldn't go down before nightfall. After lunch, there was a knock at the door, a sharp rap. Unusual in the dead of winter. Calder opened it to find Ira Thompson, bundled in layers. His face lined deeper than usual. "Thought I'd check in," Ira said, glancing at the sky. "Town's worried this one'll knock out everything. Figured you'd be ready." Calder nodded. Come in, warm up. Ira stepped inside, giving a nod to Juniper as she passed him a mug of coffee without a word. His eyes lingered on her briefly, curious, but like most folks in Havenridge, he didn't ask outright. They talked for a while, about the storm, about which neighbors might need extra firewood, who'd likely be out of supplies. You know how it is, Ira said, setting down his empty mug. When the power goes, folks pull together. Calder glanced at Maisie, who was now listening intently, then at Juniper. Looks like we'll have a long night, he agreed. By late afternoon, the storm raged in earnest. Snow slapped hard against the windows, the wind howling through the cracks. As expected, the lights blinked twice, then died. Maisie whimpered softly in the dimness. Calder moved quickly, lighting the lanterns and stoking the fire higher. Juniper appeared beside him, steady as ever, without panic. "What do you need?" she asked. He handed her extra candles. "Set these in the kitchen and hallway." Outside, the wind roared like a freight train. Calder didn't waste time worrying. Instead, he slipped into his coat and boots, grabbing extra wood and supplies. He'd spent enough winters here to know there'd be neighbors worse off. Older folks, single mothers, anyone without a generator. Ira had already headed down the road, making his rounds. Juniper watched as Calder packed supplies into the sled. "You're going out in this," he nodded. "Can't let folks freeze." She hesitated, then grabbed her own coat. "I'll come." Calder gave her a sharp glance. "You don't have to." "I want to," she cut in firmly, her eyes steady. For a brief moment, something flickered in his chest, unexpected but undeniable. Without another word, he nodded. They trudged through the deepening snow, the sled heavy between them, their breath coming fast and sharp in the freezing air. At each house, Calder knocked, offering extra firewood or checking in on the residents. Some accepted gratefully, others waved them off, too proud but warmed by the gesture all the same. Juniper worked without complaint, her hands raw from the cold, her face flushed. Calder noticed how she asked after people, learning their names, their needs, without condescension, without pity, just kindness. By the time they returned to the cabin, the storm showed no sign of letting up. They stamped snow from their boots, faces numb, shoulders aching. Maisie threw herself at Calder the moment he stepped inside. "You're back!" she cried, clinging to his leg. He ruffled her hair gently. "Told you, Bug. Always come back." Juniper set down her gloves, her expression unreadable. The flickering firelight played across her features, softening the sharp edges. Calder poured 2 mugs of tea, sliding one toward her without a word. They sat for a while in silence, listening to the storm rage outside, the only sound inside a crackling of logs and Maisie's quiet breathing as she dozed by the hearth. Finally, Juniper spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where I come from. People don't do this." Calder looked at her, one brow raised. "Do what?" "Check on their neighbors," she said, gaze fixed on the fire. "Give without expecting anything back." Calder took a sip of his tea, considering. "Out here," he said after a pause, "you learn real quick. No one gets through the storm alone." She nodded, but her eyes remained distant. A part of Calder wanted to ask why she was really here, what she was running from, but instead he simply added, "Most of the time it's not the big things that matter, it's showing up. That's how people remember you." Juniper's eyes met his then, something raw and unguarded flickering there as the night wore on and the storm raged louder. They sat together by the fire, 2 people who had nothing in common on the surface, but who understood, perhaps more, than they realized what it meant to weather life's coldest nights. The morning after the storm arrived, like a breath held too long, finally released. The world outside shimmered in pristine white, icicles hanging like glass teeth from the porch eaves. And the sky, at last, was clear, an endless stretch of cold, blue. Inside the cabin, warmth still clung to the air. Calder stood by the stove, stirring oatmeal, while Maisie colored quietly at the table. Across from her, Juniper sat, hands wrapped around a steaming mug, eyes distant despite the cozy scene. For the first time since she'd arrived, something in her posture seemed less guarded, yet at the same time, there was a certain heaviness, hanging just beneath the surface. Calder had noticed it last night too, as they'd sat by the fire in silence after returning from their rounds. She'd been unusually quiet, staring at the flames long after Maisie had drifted off to sleep. Something about the way she'd watched him, not pitying, not detached, had lodged itself stubbornly in the back of his mind. Now, as he watched her absently trace the rim of her mug, he had the distinct feeling she was turning something over. In her head, Maisie broke the quiet first. "Miss Juniper, when the road's clear, will you stay longer?" Juniper glanced up, startled, and then offered a faint smile. "I don't know, sweetheart." Maisie tilted her head, unconvinced. "Daddy says people who fix things shouldn't leave too soon." Calder raised an eyebrow at his daughter, but didn't correct her. Juniper's smile wavered slightly. "Your daddy's a smart man." Before Maisie could ask more, Calder nodded toward the door. "Ira's coming by later to check on things. Might head into town after. Need anything?" Juniper shook her head quickly. "I'll stay here, maybe help Maisie with her drawings." Calder nodded, though something in him prickled, an awareness that she'd declined too quickly, too firmly. Later, as Calder left for town, the cabin fell into a quiet hush. Juniper stood at the window for a long moment, watching his figure disappear down the snow-covered road. Maisie, now napping in the next room, her heart felt heavy, like something pressing against her ribs she couldn't quite name. The truth was, she hadn't planned on staying this long. When she'd first taken the mountain road days ago, it was supposed to be temporary, a brief escape from meetings, from headlines, from board members whose smiles were as sharp as knives. Vaughan Enterprises was her legacy by blood, but never by choice. She'd always felt more like a figurehead than a person. But here, in this creaky cabin with mismatched chairs and a child's laughter, she'd felt something she hadn't known. She was missing. She shook her head, pushing away the thought, and wandered toward the kitchen counter to tidy up. That's when she saw it, an envelope half tucked beneath a stack of papers. It was nothing out of the ordinary. Calder's handwriting scrawled across the front, addressed to the local utility company, but beneath it, something else peeked out, a small letterhead embossed faintly with a logo she recognized immediately. Her breath caught. It was her company's seal. Her pulse quickened as she slid the paper free. It wasn't much, just a folded invoice tucked inside a past-due notice. But the name printed at the top was unmistakable: Vaughan Enterprises. She stood frozen for a moment, the weight of it settling over her. So Calder had done business, unknowingly, with the empire she represented. Juniper set the paper down carefully, her heart thudding in her chest. Questions tumbled over one another. How far did Calder's struggles reach? How much of this quiet resilience had been held together with duct tape and hope? And more importantly, what would he think if he knew who she really was? That afternoon, Calder returned to the cabin just as the sun dipped low, casting long amber shadows across the snowdrifts. He found Juniper sitting by the hearth, Maisie curled against her side, both of them deep in some storybook. For a moment, Calder just watched them. The way Juniper's voice softened when Maisie pointed at the pictures, the way her smile crinkled, the corners of her eyes. Something stirred in his chest, unbidden. He cleared his throat and Juniper looked up, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Everything all right?" he asked casually, hanging his coat. She hesitated a beat too long. "Fine, just thinking." Maisie jumped up, pulling Calder toward the table to show him her latest drawing, a picture of the cabin, flanked by stick figures. Calder, Maisie, and Juniper all holding hands. Calder's breath caught slightly. Later, after Maisie was tucked in bed and the house quiet again, Calder poured 2 mugs of tea and passed one to Juniper, who accepted it without meeting his eyes. Something was off. He felt it like a shift in the wind before a storm. "You've been somewhere else today," he said quietly. She looked down at the mug, then back at him, her gaze steady but conflicted. "There's something I haven't told you," she said. At last, her voice barely above a whisper, Calder felt his shoulders tense, but he nodded, waiting. Juniper took a breath, fingers tightening around the ceramic. "I didn't just get lost on the mountain road," she admitted. "I was running from something, or maybe from myself." He said nothing, watching her closely. "My family owns Vaughan Enterprises," she continued, her voice quiet but clear. "It's a large company. You've probably never heard of it, but it's mine." There it was. The truth laid bare. Between them, Calder didn't react immediately, his face unreadable. Finally, he set down his mug, voice calm. "So, you're a billionaire?" Juniper swallowed hard. "Yes." The silence stretched long, heavy. Then Calder's eyes met hers, steady as always. "Money's not what makes someone worth knowing," he said simply. Juniper blinked, as if she hadn't expected that answer. Calder stood, glancing toward Maisie's door, then back at her. Actions speak louder. Always have. And just like that, the air between them shifted. Fragile but honest. The following days unfolded like threads pulling taut, stretched thin between spoken truths and the spaces left unspoken. Haven Ridge remained cloaked in snow, though now the sky was clearer, the air lighter. Yet inside Calder's cabin, something weighed heavy, less visible than the storm outside, but undeniable. Juniper could feel it in the way Calder moved, still polite, still steady, but quieter somehow. A man who'd learned to shoulder burdens without complaint, but who kept walls. High when uncertain, Maisie, blissfully unaware, flitted between them, her laughter filling the gaps. But even she seemed to notice the subtle shift, glancing between her father and Juniper with curious eyes. Juniper tried to act normal, helping Calder stack wood, sweeping snow off the porch steps, sitting at the table to help Maisie with her schoolwork. But there was no pretending away the truth anymore, not after the confession she'd made. Every now and then, she caught Calder watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. Something unreadable flickered in his gaze, less about her wealth, she sensed, and more about what it meant, what it changed, and it gnawed at her. Because she didn't know how to bridge that widening gap. It wasn't until 3 days later that the unspoken tension came to a head. That morning, Calder announced he'd be heading out to the old schoolhouse, where a few locals had gathered to patch the roof before spring thaw could cause more damage. Juniper offered to tag along, but he shook his head, expression polite but distant. "Won't be long," he said, voice even. Juniper watched him go, something cold settling beneath her ribs. Maisie tugged at her sleeve. "Why don't you come to town with me and Miss Della?" she asked brightly. "She said I could help at the cafe today." Juniper hesitated, then nodded. "That sounds nice. Anything to get out of the house and away from the ache pressing between the walls." Della's cafe buzzed with quiet energy as the storm's aftermath began to thaw. Locals gathered over coffee, exchanging news, while the smell of fresh-baked bread and wood smoke filled the air. Juniper busied herself wiping tables, letting Maisie chatter away with Della behind the counter. The rhythm of small-town life moved around her, familiar faces, familiar routines. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it only emphasized how much of an outsider she was. Della approached after a while, setting down a fresh pot of coffee. Her sharp eyes scanned Juniper, never one to tiptoe. "You've got that look," Della said bluntly. Juniper arched a brow. "What look?" "The one folks get when they're thinking too loud." Juniper gave a soft laugh, but it lacked conviction. "I guess I have a lot on my mind." Della poured herself a cup, leaning against the counter. I've lived here long enough to know Calder Hayes. He's solid as oak, but he doesn't trust easy. Juniper swallowed. I didn't mean to lie. Della waved a hand. Didn't say you did. But folks around here, we don't care much. For masks. Calder even less. She hesitated, then softened her tone. Thing is, people aren't just worried about who you are. They're wondering if you're planning to stay or just passing through. Juniper stared into her mug, the question echoing louder than the chatter around her. Stay. The thought had crept in more than once lately, uninvited but persistent. She didn't answer, but Della gave her shoulder a gentle pat before walking away. That evening, Calder returned late, dusted in sawdust and streaks of mud. Maisie raced to meet him at the door, chattering about her day, and he listened, patient as always, ruffling her hair. Juniper stood in the doorway, uncertain. When Maisie disappeared to wash up, Calder glanced at Juniper, expression unreadable. How was town? He asked simply. She swallowed. Busy, Maisie helped Della at the cafe. He nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. There was a beat of silence, heavy with the weight of all they weren't saying. Finally, Juniper took a step closer. Calder. He looked up, eyes meeting hers. She hesitated. Then, like pulling loose a thread she could no longer ignore, she spoke. I never meant to bring all this noise into your life. I didn't plan on staying this long, but... Her voice faltered slightly. This place, you and Maisie, it feels more real than anything waiting for me back there. She watched him carefully, searching for something in his face. Calder exhaled slowly, folding his arms. What's real doesn't disappear when it's inconvenient. Her throat tightened. I'm not here to buy my way in, she added quietly. I don't want to fix things with money. He studied her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, but steady. Juniper, I don't care about your bank account. Never did. He paused. But I've spent my life building something solid for Maisie. For myself. What I need to know is whether you're here because you're looking for solid ground, or because this is just another stop on the way back to somewhere else. Her chest ached at his words. The quiet, steady honesty of them. She opened her mouth, but no answer came. Not yet. Instead, she nodded, swallowing down the emotion clawing at her throat. I'll give you space, she whispered. And she stepped back, leaving Calder standing in the soft light of the doorway, both of them, holding pieces of something fragile, unsure how to fit them back together. The days that followed stretched long and quiet, like the hush between snowfall and thaw. Spring felt distant, though the sun lingered a little longer each afternoon, casting softer shadows across the snow-laden hills of Havenridge. Juniper stayed, busy, helping Maisie with her lessons, sweeping the porch steps, stacking firewood beside Calder without being asked. From the outside, nothing seemed out of place, but Calder felt the shift. Subtle yet unmistakable, in the careful way she moved. Around him, the conversations had thinned, polite but measured, like they both tiptoed around something too fragile to name. He told himself it was for the best. She'd said she needed space, and he respected that. Truthfully, Calder wasn't sure what else he had left to give. But Maisie noticed. One morning, as Calder finished repairing a loose shutter, Maisie climbed up beside him on the porch swing, her small brow furrowed. "Daddy," she asked quietly, "is Miss Juniper leaving soon?" The question caught him off guard. He swallowed, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I don't know, Bug," he admitted softly. Maisie chewed her lip, thinking hard. "I don't want her to go." Calder looked down at her earnest face, feeling something tighten in his chest. He ruffled her hair gently. "Sometimes people leave, doesn't mean they don't care." But the words felt heavy in his mouth. That afternoon, Calder walked into town, needing space, needing motion. The old schoolhouse stood at the far end of Main Street, its whitewashed walls peeling, the bell tower leaning slightly to one side. It had stood empty for years, ever since funding dried up and families moved away in search of better prospects. He stopped at the gate, staring at the sagging roof, the cracked steps. Maisie would start at the new school across county lines. Soon, but Calder hated the thought of the place falling apart. It was more than a building. It was a piece of what this town used to be. He was still standing there when Ira Thompson approached, his cane tapping rhythmically against the packed snow. "Afternoon, Calder," Ira greeted, following his gaze. "Still thinking about fixing her up, huh?" Calder gave a small nod. "Wouldn't take much. Just a few hands, some lumber." Ira chuckled dryly. "A few hands might be harder to come by these days." Calder glanced at him. "Maybe." Ira studied him for a beat longer. "You've got more folks willing to help than you think, son. Sometimes you just gotta ask." Calder nodded again, though the words stuck with him longer than they should. When he returned home, the house smelled faintly of something sweet. Maisie was perched at the kitchen table, scribbling furiously, while Juniper stood by the stove, pulling a tray of cookies from the oven. She glanced up when he entered, a soft smile tugging at her lips, though there was still a shadow behind her eyes. "I thought Maisie could use a treat," she explained lightly, brushing flour from her hands. Calder nodded, the ache in his chest unexpected. Later, after Maisie had gone to bed and the house had settled into its usual quiet rhythm, Calder found Juniper out on the porch, her arms folded, gaze fixed on the dark outline of the mountains. He stepped beside her, the night air cool against his skin. "You bake often?" he asked softly. She gave a small laugh. "First time in years." They stood in silence for a while, the sky above them scattered with stars, the town's lights faint in the distance. Finally Calder spoke. "I was at the old schoolhouse today." Juniper glanced at him, curiosity flickering. "Place is falling apart," he continued. "Could be something again if folks pulled together." She tilted her head. "Why haven't they?" Calder shrugged. "People get used to things breaking down, figure someone else'll fix it." Juniper's eyes lingered on him. "Maybe they're waiting for someone to show them how." Her voice was quiet, but it hit something deep. He exhaled slowly, turning to face her fully. "Juniper, when you first showed up, I figured you'd stay a night, maybe two, then be gone." She didn't flinch, but her hands gripped the railing. "Und tighter. I never expected you to stay," he went on, voice steady. "But now you're here, and I don't know if I'm supposed to be waiting for you to leave or hoping you'll stay." The words hung between them, raw and unpolished. Juniper's eyes shimmered faintly in the moonlight. She looked away, struggling to find footing. "I don't know either," she admitted softly, "but I'm tired of running." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Calder felt something inside him shift, something long held and heavy loosening. He reached out, his hand brushing gently against hers. "You don't have to run here," he said quietly. She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw the walls she'd built flicker, waver. For a moment, neither spoke, but in that silence, something unspoken settled between them, an understanding, fragile but real. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be decisions, conversations yet to come. But tonight, on that quiet porch under the stars, it was enough. The sun broke through the clouds the next morning, casting golden streaks across the blanket of snow that still covered Haven Ridge. It was one of those crisp, clear days where winter seemed to loosen its grip just slightly, a whisper of spring, hidden beneath the chill. Calder stood by the window, watching as the light stretched long over the hills. Maisie sat at the kitchen table, colouring quietly, while Juniper prepared breakfast, her movements more relaxed than they'd been in days. There was a different air between them now, Last night's conversation still lingered, unsaid things, tentative but present. Calder felt it in the way Juniper glanced at him when she thought he wasn't looking, in the soft curve of her smile when Maisie giggled. But it wasn't until mid-morning, after Maisie ran out to play in the yard, that Juniper turned to him, her expression thoughtful, something steady in her eyes. "I want to talk to you about something," she said, her voice calm but purposeful. Calder set down his coffee, eyebrows lifting. "All right." Juniper took a breath, glancing briefly toward the window before meeting his gaze again. "I've been thinking about the schoolhouse." Calder stilled, surprised. "You mentioned how folks need someone to start," she continued. "And I've spent most of my life watching people use money to control, to take more. But I don't want to do that." Her voice softened, but there was a fire beneath it. "I want to use what I have to give something back, not just to you, but to this town, to help fix what's falling apart." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I'd like to invest in restoring the schoolhouse, fund repairs, supplies, whatever's needed, but I want you to lead it." Calder blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected this, not from her. She smiled faintly at his silence, almost shy. "You don't have to say yes right away. I know it's a lot." He studied her, seeing not the polished heiress who first showed up at his doorstep, but the woman who trudged through snow to check on neighbors, who knelt beside Maisie with paint-stained fingers, who stood on his porch last night, admitting she was tired of running. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "I'm not used to people offering without strings." Juniper's eyes softened. "There aren't any." Another pause stretched between them, filled with more than words could carry. "I'll think on it," Calder said quietly. She nodded, and for the first time, relief flickered in her gaze. Later that afternoon, Calder found himself at the schoolhouse again. The wind had calmed, leaving the air cool but still. He ran his hand along the worn siding, imagining fresh paint, repaired windows, children's voices filling the empty space once more. Ira's words came back to him. "Sometimes you just gotta ask." He stood there for a long while, weighing possibilities heavier than any hammer in his hands. By the time he returned home, dusk had begun to settle. Maisie was curled by the fire, reading aloud to Juniper, who looked up when Calder entered, something unreadable flickering across her face. He stepped into the room, removing his coat, glancing between them. "I've been thinking," Calder said, voice measured. Juniper straightened slightly, waiting. "I'll take you up on your offer." Her eyes widened, but she said nothing. "But on one condition," he added. She tilted her head. "What's that?" "You don't just fund it," he said evenly. "You're part of it, planning, rebuilding every step." Juniper blinked, surprised. "This isn't something money fixes alone," he continued. "It's hands, effort, people. And you're part of this place now, whether you planned it or not." For a heartbeat, she simply stared at him. Then slowly, she smiled, small but real, something settling in her shoulders. "I'd like that," she said softly. Calder gave a short nod, but his gaze lingered on her a moment longer. Word of the plan spread faster than he expected. The next day, Della showed up at the cabin with a tray of muffins and a knowing smile. "Got wind you're stirring up something at the old schoolhouse," she remarked casually. Calder chuckled. "Looks that way." She gave Juniper a pointed glance. "Guess you're not just passing through after all." Juniper smiled back, no longer flinching at the attention. "Seems not." By the week's end, several townsfolk had volunteered, offering tools, spare wood, even an extra pair of hands. Folks who had once resigned themselves to watching the town fade found themselves talking about plans, possibilities, and at the center of it, Calder noticed how Juniper moved among them, not as someone offering charity, but as someone rebuilding right alongside them. Each evening, when the sun dipped low and the air grew crisp, they returned to the cabin, exhausted but filled with a quiet energy that hadn't existed before. One night, after Maisie had gone to Abed Calder stood out on the porch, watching the moon rise over the ridge. Juniper joined him, her breath clouding in the cool air. "I never thought I'd find this," she said softly. He glanced at her. "Find what?" "A place where I felt like I belonged." Calder's gaze lingered on her face, the lines softened by moonlight. "Funny thing about belonging," he murmured. "Sometimes it's just showing up and staying long enough to see it." Juniper's lips curved, but she said nothing, and standing there side by side under the vast stretch of sky, the distance between them felt smaller than ever before. Spring arrived in Havenridge, not with fanfare, but in subtle shifts. The snow retreating into shadows, the river cracking free from its icy hold, sap rising slow in the pines. Yet, it wasn't just nature awakening. The old schoolhouse stood, at the center of the town now, scaffolded and bustling. Over the past weeks, neighbors who once kept to themselves began showing up, tools in hand, sleeves rolled high. Each board replaced, each window pane fitted back in place, felt like a piece of something larger falling into alignment. Calder worked steady, as always, but there was a lightness to his movements now, a quiet purpose. Juniper, never one to stay. Idle, painted, hammered, carried supplies, shoulder to shoulder with the others. No longer an outsider, but part of the rhythm. By early May, Della proposed what everyone had silently been yearning for. A celebration. Not a grand affair, but something to mark not just the schoolhouse's revival, but the town's. The Festival of Lights, she suggested. String lanterns up Main Street, maybe music, food. A way to remind everyone, after a long, hard winter, how far they'd come. Juniper's eyes lit up at the idea. Calder saw it. The same spark he'd noticed when she first offered to help. He nodded quietly. Maisie was the most excited, already crafting paper lanterns, covering them in drawings of stars, trees and crooked cabins under sunny skies. The afternoon of the festival arrived, the air balmy with a hint of wood smoke. Townsfolk bustled around, stringing up lanterns, laying out tables of pies, bread, jars of preserves. Laughter and chatter echoed down the street, light spilling from the newly restored schoolhouse windows. Juniper moved gracefully among them, her hair braided back, sleeves pushed up, cheeks flushed with the effort of the day. Calder caught himself, watching her more than once, a quiet smile tugging at the edges of his mouth. It felt natural now, this rhythm they'd fallen into, like she'd always belonged. As dusk settled, lanterns flickered to life one by one, small glowing orbs swaying, gently above the street, casting soft light against the darkening sky. Children darted between them, their laughter threading through the evening air. Calder stood near the schoolhouse steps, hands in his pockets, watching the town pulse with life. Juniper approached, her expression unreadable but gentle. "You ever seen Havenridge like this?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Not in a long time." She glanced around, eyes shimmering faintly. "It's beautiful." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the glow of lanterns reflecting in their faces. Then Juniper cleared her throat, voice quieter. "There's something I've been meaning to say." Calder turned to her fully, sensing the shift in her tone. "I came here running," she admitted, "from expectations, pressure, from myself mostly." Her gaze met his, steady now. "But this place, you, Maisie, everyone, you reminded me of something I forgot. That life isn't about what you build on paper, it's about who you stand beside." She swallowed, breath hitching slightly. "I don't want to run anymore. I want to stay, if you'll let me." Calder's chest tightened, though his expression remained calm. "You don't need my permission," he said softly. "But I'd be damn glad if you stayed." Juniper let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her smile breaking slow and warm. Before either could say more, Maisie came racing up, tugging at their sleeves. "Daddy! Miss Juniper, come see." She led them toward the center of the street, where the townsfolk had gathered, music starting to hum softly, fiddles, guitar, voices rising in easy harmony. Lantern light shimmered overhead, casting golden halos across. Familiar faces. Itra stood chatting with Della. A group of teenagers danced nearby, laughter rippling under the melody. It wasn't extravagant, but it was theirs. Juniper slipped her hand into Calder's without hesitation, fingers twining with his naturally, as though she'd always been meant to stand beside him. He glanced down, squeezing gently. No promises spoken aloud, but something certain passed between them. Solid, quiet, unshakable. As the night deepened, Maisie released a small paper lantern, sending it floating gently into the dark sky. Calder watched it rise, the glow fading into starlight, and felt something loosen deep inside, a weight he'd carried too long slipping. Free! Beside him, Juniper tilted her head back, eyes bright, her smile soft but sure. It wasn't about grand gestures or fortunes amassed. It was about this, the way light could return after the longest winter, the way broken things could be made whole, and how sometimes the people who showed up when you least expected were the ones who stayed. Spring melted fully into summer in Haven Ridge, the hills blooming wild with color, the river running fast and clear. The snow that once weighed heavy on roofs and shoulders alike had long receded, leaving behind something brighter, a town stitched together not by circumstance, but by choice. The schoolhouse doors swung open now, laughter spilling out like sunlight. The paint was fresh, the windows repaired, and children filled the once empty rooms. The Calder haze, every nail, every beam in that place felt like a heartbeat, something steady, rebuilt not just for his daughter, but for everyone who called this town home. He stood outside on a quiet afternoon, wiping sawdust from his hands, gazing at the finished building. Behind him, footsteps approached softly, ones he could recognize without turning. Juniper stopped beside him, her smile easy, eyes reflecting the light. They finished hanging the last bookshelf, she said. Gently, Calder glanced at her. Did they? She nodded, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Maisie says she wants to stock it herself. He chuckled under his breath. Sounds about right. They stood there for a long moment, letting the warm breeze carry the sound of children's voices. It still amazed Calder sometimes, how seamlessly Juniper had become woven into the fabric of his days. Not as a guest, not as a stranger, but as something much more permanent. It wasn't grand declarations or sweeping gestures. It was the quiet way she showed up, day after day, sleeves rolled, hands steady, and it was that steadiness that had changed him. That evening the town gathered again, not for a festival this time, but something simpler. A picnic spread along the riverbank, neighbors lingering long after the sun dipped below the ridge. Children darted between blankets, the smell of grilled corn and fresh bread filling the air. Calder sat with Maisie at his side, her head resting on his shoulder as she pointed out shapes in the clouds. Across from them, Juniper laughed at something. Della said, her face flushed with the ease of belonging. Ira wandered over, cane tapping rhythmically. Well, Hayes, he remarked, squinting out at the river, didn't think I'd see this town come back to life like this. Calder smiled faintly. Neither did I. Ira gave him a long, knowing look. Funny how it happens when you stop holding everything up on your own. Calder's gaze drifted to Juniper, who met his eyes across the crowd, her expression soft. Yeah, he murmured, voice low. Funny how that happens. Later, after the sun had slipped below the horizon and the town slowly dispersed, Calder lingered by the water's edge, the sound of crickets rising. Juniper joined him without a word, their shoulders brushing lightly. For a while they just stood there, listening to the river. Finally, Calder broke the silence. I spent a long time thinking I had to carry everything myself, he said quietly. The weight of raising Maisie, keeping things together, it felt like if I stopped moving, everything would fall apart. Juniper watched him carefully, saying nothing. "But you showed me something," he continued. "You can't build something lasting with just your own two hands. It takes more." He turned to her fully, eyes steady. "You didn't just change my life, Juniper. You became part of it." Her breath caught slightly, but she didn't look away. "I want you here," Calder said simply. "Not just for now, for good." She swallowed, heart beating fast in her chest. "Are you sure?" His smile was slow but certain. "Yeah," he answered softly. "I'm sure." Juniper's eyes shimmered faintly, and she reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't rushed. It was solid. It was enough. Weeks passed, and summer deepened. The schoolhouse thrived. The cafe bustled. The town grew vibrant in ways no one had expected. Calder's workshop expanded, Maisie thrived, and every evening the porch light at the Hayes cabin flickered on, casting a warm glow over the quiet road. One afternoon, Calder found Juniper sitting on the steps, a notebook in her lap. She glanced up as he approached, her smile bright. "What are you working on?" he asked. She flipped the notebook closed, eyes glinting with something mischievous. "Just a few ideas." He raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Her grin widened. "For the fall festival," she replied. "Thought we might make it a tradition." Calder laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "Are you really planning to stay forever, huh?" Juniper leaned forward, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "Forever sounds pretty good," she murmured. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the town in soft gold, Calder realized something he hadn't dared believe months ago. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was living. It was home. So, what did you think of Calder and Juniper's journey? I'd love to know. Where are you watching from today? Are you from a small town like Havenridge, or maybe a big city looking for a little quiet inspiration? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. It always warms my heart to see where everyone is tuning in from and how these simple stories resonate around the world. And if you enjoy these gentle, uplifting tales, stories that remind us of the power of kindness, family, and second chances, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There are many more heartfelt stories waiting for you here. Thank you truly for spending your time with me today. It means more than you know. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other.